I always burned the wood myself, not because I had to. My son-in-law offered more than once, standing in my kitchen with that easy smile of his, reaching for the matches before I could even cross the room. But the fireplace in that cabin was mine. I was the one who'd driven 4 hours north to Haliburton on a November weekend with a truck bed full of lumber and a contractor who owed me a favor. I was the one who'd chosen the fieldstone, who'd argued with the mason about the mortar color, who'd sat on an overturned bucket in the cold and watched every single piece get set, so I burned the wood myself. That's what I was doing the Wednesday evening my daughter called. Not to talk, but to say something she had clearly rehearsed. It was the 14th of March, just past 7. I remember because the hockey game was on and I muted it when the phone rang, thinking it would be quick. She said, "Mom, Stuart and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we used the cabin on our own this summer. Just our family. Stuart says it gets confusing when there are too many people, and with the kids getting older." I let her finish. I sat in the chair my late husband had picked out at a shop in Orillia 22 years ago, the one with the scratch on the left armrest from when we moved it 3 times before we found the right corner for it, and I let her finish. Then I said, "All right, I'll think about it." I don't know why I said that. I think part of me believed she would hear herself, later replaying the conversation while she washed the dinner dishes, and that she would call back. She didn't call back. I want to tell you about the cabin properly, because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what happened to it. My husband, Alec, this is before he got sick, had this idea. He'd grown up in northern Ontario, not far from Bancroft, and he always said that people who didn't have somewhere quiet to go in this country were missing the whole point of living here. We weren't wealthy people. He was a civil engineer with the municipality, and I was a school librarian for 31 years. We didn't have an inheritance. We saved, every year, a little more into the fund he called, half-jokingly, the escape account. It took us 11 years. The land was 40 minutes west of Haliburton Village, 4 acres backing on to a small lake with no name that appears on provincial maps. There was a seasonal road, a stand of white birch along the eastern edge, and nothing else. Alex stood on the property the morning we closed and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "We did it." Just those 3 words. He died before the structure was finished. A cardiac event, sudden, on a Thursday afternoon in early October. He was 63. The contractor called me that same week to say he understood if I wanted to stop the build and he wouldn't charge cancellation fees. I told him to keep going. I used Alec's life insurance, $140,000, and my pension supplement to see it through. I finished what we started. That's the only way I've ever known how to do anything. The cabin went up over the following spring and summer. 3 bedrooms, a sleeping loft, a wraparound porch on the south side, the fieldstone fireplace. I picked a front door the color of spruce bark, dark green-gray, because Alec had once pointed to a door like that on a house in Muskoka and said, "That's the right color for the north." I kept a photograph of him taken the last time we visited the land together. He's standing in the birch grove, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at something just off camera. It's the photo I put on the mantel above the fieldstone fireplace so he'd be in the room with me. I spent 12 summers in that cabin. My daughter and her family came most years for the long weekend in July, and often a week in August. My son visited when he could manage it from Vancouver. I hosted my 2 closest friends from the school, women I have known since 1987, and we sat on that south porch with wine and the kind of conversation you can only have when there are no phones and no obligation to be anywhere by morning. It was a good place. It was the best place I ever made. I want to be honest about Stuart because I don't think the story is as simple as a villain walking in from outside. My daughter met him when she was 34, and I was glad for her. He's not a mean man. He has a way of taking charge of things, dinners, conversations, holidays, that I think he means as helpfulness, though it has always had a faint flavor of assumption to it. He booked the cabin for himself and my daughter starting that second summer. Without asking me, he just said casually, "We're planning on the third week of August. Does that work for you?" As though the question of whether it worked for me to allow it was already settled and we were only sorting logistics. I should have corrected that then. I know that now. Instead, I said, "Of course, that works fine." The arrangement grew. First, it was 1 week, then it was the 2 July-long weekends and 2 weeks in August because they'd taken the kids out of summer camp and needed somewhere with space. Then, Stuart started suggesting improvements. The dock should be lengthened. The canoe should be replaced. It was old, he said, and not safe for the kids, which was fair enough, though he said it as though the decision were already made. The pull-out couch in the loft needed replacing. He mentioned once that they might look at building a second bathroom off the north bedroom, and I said nothing, which I think he took as agreement, because the following spring he emailed me a quote from a contractor in Minden. I called my daughter that time. I said, "He can't be commissioning renovations on my property without asking me." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Mom, he's just trying to make it nicer. For everyone. For everyone." The cabin I had built with the money from my husband's life. The cabin with Alex's photograph on the mantel. I didn't push it further. I told myself it was a small thing. I was wrong about that. The summer before the phone call, they stayed for 3 weeks. I came up the second weekend, which I'd always done, and I noticed that some of my things had been moved. The mugs I kept in the top cabinet had been reorganized. The extra blankets from the cedar chest were in a plastic bin in the storage room, and there was a new coffee maker on the counter that wasn't mine. A large one, the kind you'd have in an office. It had displaced the old drip machine Alec and I had bought at a Canadian Tire in Barrie on our first long weekend trip up, years before the land was even ours. I found the old machine in the back of a cupboard, unplugged, the cord wrapped around it with a rubber band. I plugged it back in. I put it on the counter. I said nothing to anyone. But I noticed. The March call was not the first volley then. It was just the most direct one. After I told her I'd think about it, I sat with it for several days. I spoke to my friend Winifred, who had retired from teaching the same year I did and who has a sharper tongue than anyone I've ever met. She said, without pausing, "You know what you should do." I said I wasn't sure. She said, "Yes, you are." I called my other friend, Bet, not the one from the video, a different one. My Bet has been my friend since we both had children in diapers, and she said more gently that I needed to ask myself who the cabin was for. "Who did you build it for?" she said. "And who does it belong to now in practice?" I didn't answer her right away. I wrote it down on a piece of paper that night. Just those 2 questions, and then I wrote the answer, which I already knew. I had built it for Alec and for me. It belonged to me on paper and to my son-in-law in practice. And that had happened so gradually, I hadn't noticed until the old coffee maker was wrapped in a rubber band in a cupboard. I called my daughter back after 9 days. I said I'd thought about it, and I wanted to talk in person. She drove out to my house in Ottawa on a Saturday in late March. Stuart stayed home. She said the kids had hockey, and we sat in my kitchen, and I told her that I wasn't comfortable with the arrangement as it stood, that I felt increasingly like a guest at my own property, that I wanted us to go back to how it had been in the earlier years, where we discussed availability, and no one simply assumed they had priority access. She listened. I'll give her that. And then she said, "Mom, I think you're being a little unfair. We've put a lot into that place, too." I asked her what she meant. She said Stuart had spent his own money on the dock extension, on the new canoe, on various things over the years, and she thought that counted for something. I said he did those things without asking me. I didn't commission them. I didn't ask for them. And they don't transfer ownership. She got very quiet. Then she said, "He was just trying to help." There it was again. He was just trying. He was just helping. He just thought it would be better if I didn't come. I told her I loved her. I told her this had nothing to do with love. I told her that property is property, and I needed her to understand that. She left earlier than I expected. She hugged me at the door briefly, and I stood on the step and watched her car until I couldn't see it anymore. I want to tell you about the Monday morning 6 weeks later, because that is where the real story is. I had decided to drive up to the cabin for the May long weekend, Victoria Day weekend, which I'd spent there every year since the build was completed. I hadn't told my daughter specifically because I didn't think I needed to. It was my cabin. It was a statutory holiday. I'd been going there every Victoria Day since she was in her 30s. I left Ottawa at 6 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and the radio on low. The drive north is one of the things I love. The highway giving way to county roads. The trees getting taller and denser. The light different up there even on gray mornings. I turned onto the seasonal road at 10:30. There'd been a wet spring, and there were potholes, but nothing my car couldn't handle. I pulled up to the cabin and turned off the engine, and then I tried the front door. The key didn't work. I tried it twice the way you do when your brain hasn't caught up yet. In-turn resistance. In-turn resistance. The lock had been changed. I stood on the porch I had built with the money from my husband's life insurance, and I could not open my own front door. I walked around to the back. Same lock. Same result. I sat down on the bench along the south porch, the one I'd bought at an estate sale in Haliburton village, sanded down and repainted myself, and I sat there for probably 4 minutes looking at the lake. The birches were just coming into bud. The water was still with that particular stillness you only get in May before the summer people arrive, and I made a decision. I did not call my daughter. I did not drive back to Ottawa. I drove into a Haliburton village and I found a locksmith. His name was on a placard in the window of a hardware store on Highland Street. I called the number. He was available. I told him I owned a property outside the village, that the locks appeared to have been changed without my knowledge or consent, and that I needed access to my own property. I had the deed in my document folder. I carry it whenever I go up, have done for years, habit from when the road was first put in, and there'd been questions about property boundaries. I showed him the deed. He followed my car out to the cabin. It took him 11 minutes. I made him a cup of tea. The old drip machine was still in the cupboard, and I plugged it in. And I sat at the kitchen table while he drank it, and we talked about the road conditions and whether the ice had gone out on the lake yet. After he left, I changed my own locks. I drove back into the village and bought 2 new locksets at the hardware store, the heavy commercial kind, and I installed them myself. I am not a helpless woman. I have been not helpless my entire life. Then I called a locksmith in Ottawa, a different one, and asked about rekeying a set of locks so that all copies of the previous key would no longer function. He explained the process. I asked how soon he could come. I spent that Victoria Day weekend in the cabin. I read. I lit a fire in the fieldstone fireplace. I looked at Alex's photograph on the mantel. I sat on the south porch in the evenings with a glass of wine and watched the birches. I did not hear from my daughter until the following Thursday when she texted, "We were planning on the cabin this weekend, and Mom, the key isn't working." I texted back, "I know. I changed the locks. Call me when you want to talk." She called 40 minutes later. Stuart was on the call too. I could hear him in the background before he started speaking, that deliberate settling sound of someone preparing to take over a conversation. He said very calmly that I needed to understand what I was doing to the family, that the children looked forward to the cabin all year, that he had invested in the property, he used the word invested, and that what I was doing wasn't right. I said the property is mine, the locks are mine, the deed is mine, and no one is permitted to change the locks on a property they don't own. He said, "We were just making improvements." I said, "You changed the locks on my house without telling me. You locked me out of my own cabin. There is no version of that which is an improvement." There was a silence. Then he said, "I think you need to calm down." I said, "I am perfectly calm. I'm also ending this call now." And I ended the call. I spoke to a lawyer the following week. Not because I thought my daughter would actually contest ownership. The deed was unambiguous. There was no joint tenancy, no improvement agreement, nothing, but because I wanted to understand my position clearly before I made any further decisions. The lawyer, a woman about my daughter's age, listened to everything I told her, asked 2 or 3 questions, and then said, "You own the property outright. Full stop. Nothing that was done to it without your written consent creates any entitlement." She also said, gently, that if I wanted to sell, I should do so sooner rather than later, because informal arrangements had a way of getting complicated over time. I hadn't been thinking about selling. I sat with that for a while. I want to be honest here, too. The selling was hard. I had not built that cabin to sell it. I had built it to keep. I'd imagined, in the soft and private way you imagine things you don't say out loud, that one day my grandchildren would learn to swim off that dock, that the south porch would hold 3 generations, that Alex's photograph would stay on the mantel for as long as there were people to see it. But I started to understand. Sitting alone one evening in late May, looking out my Ottawa kitchen window at the backyard where nothing particular was happening, that the cabin had already changed. Not the structure, not the fieldstone or the spruce bark door, but the feeling of it. I had begun to dread going up. I had begun to feel, when I was there, that I was occupying space someone else considered theirs. The bench on the south porch, the drip machine in the cupboard, the key that hadn't worked. You cannot hold on to a place when it has stopped being yours in the ways that matter. I called a real estate agent in Haliburton in early June. She came out and walked the property on a Thursday afternoon. She said it was a lovely piece of land and the market for waterfront in that area had been strong. She gave me a number that was considerably more than I had expected. I listed it that same week. I told my daughter in a text message. I kept it short. I said the cabin was listed for sale and that the agent would be in touch about any required access for showings. I said I loved her. She called within the hour. She was crying. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was punishing the grandchildren for something they hadn't done. She said Stuart would never have changed the locks if he'd known I would react this way. I said, "How did you expect me to react?" She didn't have an answer. I said, "I drove 4 hours and couldn't get into my own cabin. Your husband locked me out of the place I'd built with your father's life insurance. What would you have done?" More silence. I said, "I love you. This is not about love." It never was. The cabin sold in 23 days. The buyers were a couple from Mississauga, both teachers, looking for something to spend summers in with their teenage kids. The wife emailed me through the agent to say they'd fallen in love with the fieldstone fireplace and the south porch. She asked if I had any particular recommendations about the area. I wrote back. I told her about the bakery in the village and the canoe routes and the fact that the birches along the east edge turned a particular yellow in October that I had never seen anywhere else. I told her the old drip machine in the cupboard was a good one if she wanted to keep it, and that the bench on the south porch had been bought at an estate sale and had held up well for years. I wished her a good first summer. I did not tell her about Alex's photograph. I brought that home with me. Before the closing, I drove up one last time. Alone, early morning, the highway quiet, I let myself in with my key, still my key, for a few more weeks, and I walked through each room slowly. I stood in front of the fireplace for a long time. I put my hand on the fieldstone, which was cold. I took the photograph down from the mantel. I wrapped it carefully in a flannel shirt I'd left in the closet. I put it in my bag. I sat on the south porch for an hour. The lake was still. The birches were full by then, deep summer green. A loon called out from somewhere on the water twice, then stalked. The money from the sale I divided carefully. I put a portion into a TFSA I hadn't fully funded in years. I set aside a portion for each grandchild's. The irony of that was not lost on me, but the accounts are for them, not for their father. I kept a portion liquid. And with the last portion, I did something I'd been thinking about since early spring. Winifred had mentioned over dinner one night that there was a group of women our age, retired or semi-retired, most of them in similar situations to ours in various ways, who were looking at buying into a shared property together, not a condo, a real property north of Kingston on the Raddo Waterway. 8 shares, 8 women. A large old house with a wraparound porch and a dock and enough bedrooms that no one had to share. I called the woman organizing it the following week. We spoke for over an hour. She was 72, a retired family physician, practical and funny and entirely no nonsense. She said the shares were almost gone, but one was still available. She said the agreement they drafted was legally airtight, with clear terms about usage and maintenance, and what happened if one of the members needed to sell her share. I said, "Send me the agreement." I read it that same night. I called my lawyer in the morning. My lawyer said it was one of the best drafted co-ownership agreements she'd seen. I bought in. There are 8 of us now. We range in age from 64 to 78. 3 of us are widows, 1 never married. 2 are divorced. We have, between us, 6 decades of teaching, nursing, legal work, social work, 2 careers in municipal government, and 1 woman who spent 30 years as a fisheries biologist and knows more about lakes than anyone I've ever met. We have strong opinions about coffee, about how to treat a dock in the spring, about whether a fire needs to be going by 7 or can wait until 8. We have a schedule. Everyone agreed to it. If you want a different week, you ask, and whoever has that week can say yes or no. And whichever answer they give is the answer, because the agreement says so, because we drafted the terms together, because no one in this group confuses generosity with entitlement. The first weekend I spent there, late August, warm evenings, the Raddo running slow and silver past the dock, I sat on the wraparound porch with Winifred and a glass of wine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. I felt like a guest nowhere. I have Alex's photograph on the windowsill in the room I use when I'm there. The fieldstone fireplace is gone, but there's a wood stove in the sitting room that does the same work. I burn the wood myself when it's my turn, not because I have to, because it's mine.